Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, today is the last video. It's the last part of the conclusion. We're going to wrap this up today. And we're just going to continue talking about the third type of repetition, that pure and empty form of time. And that's what the first part of the video is called, actually, the pure form of time. So there are two aspects to the pure form of time, the third synthesis. And this is where, if you remember way back at the beginning of the series, when we talked about when we talked about repetition and the three different types, we talked about the third type of repetition as coming about from the fracturing of the I, that caesura that Deleuze talks about. And it fractures the I into not into two types, but it fractures it such that it appears with two aspects. And the first is as a totality, or what Deleuze calls here the pure form. And the totality is the way that the I is distributed across a before, a during, and an after. And all three of these are incorporated in the simultaneity of an a priori synthesis. And so with this aspect, the totality, we have time is fixed or static. It's held constant. And the other aspect of this third synthesis is the series. And this Deleuze calls the empirical contents. And with this aspect of the series, we distinguish between not a before, during, and after, but a first, second, third, and so on. And so these then are mobile and succeed one another. So there's the two elements are kind of brought in together in this third synthesis. The element of constancy or fixedness, and the element of succession. But they're both incorporated in the third synthesis. Then Deleuze moves on to talk about the first time, or the before, and how or whether this repeats. So the question actually is, does the first time escape repetition, in which case it's referred to as once and for all, or is it repeated within a cycle or from one cycle to another? So is that first event in the series, or is the before, if we're thinking of the third synthesis as a totality, is the before an act of repetition itself? Or is it something which we can think of as an original from which all of the other repetitions, the second, third, fourth, or from which the during and the after are copies, can appear as copies in relation to? And Deleuze's answer here is it depends entirely upon the reflection of an observer. And basically what this means is that you can approach this, you can see it in two different ways. If you look at it from one perspective, the perspective of representation, then the first time being regarded as the same, the question is asked whether the second displays sufficient resemblance with the first to be identified as the same again. A question which can be answered only by the establishment of relations of analogy within judgment, taking into account the variations in empirical circumstances. So approaching repetition from the perspective of representation with that first way of understanding it. The second way is the pure form of time. Now each determination, the first, second, and third, the before, during, and after, is already repetition in itself, in the pure form of time and in relation to the image of the action. The before or the first time is no less repetition than the second or the third time. It is repetition itself that is repeated. And the idea here seems to be that the event, whether we're thinking of it again in terms of the series, first, second, third, or the first, or in terms of a totality, so the before, but the event is no longer understood as content, but as form, as totality or series, rather than the specific event itself. In other words, it's understood as the repetition of the whole process of ideas actualizing. Repetition itself is being repeated here. So you can look at it in both of these ways. In the first way, if you choose to understand it through the lens of representation, then you have an original event which is then copied. And in order to determine whether repetition takes place, we look to see if the copies resemble the original. That's the representative model, or the model of representation. And the other way of thinking it, the way of thinking in terms of difference and repetition, is to understand that first, or the before, not as an original which can then be copied, but as itself a repetition. Not a repetition of an event which came prior to it, but a repetition of this whole process. Difference through the ideas actualizing in concrete forms, in concrete realities. Okay, cool. And then Deleuze goes on to look at how these first two repetitions, the repetitions of habit and memory, how they're distributed in the pure form of time. Because the third synthesis is, remember, essentially an ordering process, a way of bringing order and organization and structure to existence, to, in this case, and it always appears in a human life. So it's bringing order and structure to a human life, to make a human life the kind of thing that it is. So the first level, so he says that these two repetitions are distributed in the third synthesis in two levels, he calls it. The first is what he calls the intracyclic hypothesis. So we'll start with a quote. The repetition of the before is defined by default or in a negative manner. One repeats because one does not know, because one does not remember, etc., or because one is not capable of performing the action, whether this action remains to be performed or is already performed. One therefore signifies here the unconscious of the id as the first power of repetition. So here we're connecting, so this is habit, the repetition of habit, but connecting this to psychoanalysis, which we've done before, which we saw at the beginning of the video series. But the psychoanalytic connection, the unconscious of the id here is playing out in this first repetition. So one does not know or cannot remember. This sounds to me like something like a repressed memory, leading to a repetition of some traumatic event or something, reenacting some kind of behavior. Or he says one cannot properly complete, he says one is not capable of performing the action, which I take to mean one can't properly complete the act, cannot properly perform something adequately. So, and again, I'm thinking of something maybe like patterns of behavior that you might have picked up that you repeat because you've failed to master, if you like, the correct or the proper or the best way of carrying out these acts. So they are repeated. And what's repeated in the first repetition in the intracyclic hypothesis is the first act. So that first act gets carried over and just repeated again. And this is essentially, as Deleuze says, defined by the negative, defined in a negative manner. Negative because one doesn't know one is doing it. It's happening without one's control. And then the second repetition within the intracyclic hypothesis, the repetition of the during is defined by a becoming similar or a becoming equal. One becomes capable of performing the action. One becomes equal to the image of the action, the one now signifying the unconscious of the ego, its metamorphosis, its projection in an I or ego ideal in the form of the second power of repetition. However, since to become similar or equal is always to become similar or equal to something that is supposed to be identical in itself, or supposed to enjoy the privilege of an originary identity, it appears that the image of the action to which one becomes similar or equal stands here only for the identity of the concept in general, or that of the I. So that's quite a long quote, and let's just try and extract, I think, some of the key points from it. So again, we've got the connection to psychoanalysis. Instead of the unconscious of the id, it's the unconscious of the ego, projecting in an I. And that this is, again, taking place within the repetition, the second repetition of memory. So here, the unconscious of the ego projecting in an I, we have a progression, if you like, from the first repetition. So one becomes equal to the task or capable of performing the act. And this is because we're projecting ourselves into the act through the creation of an I, through the creation of this ego ideal, he says. So that's what I mean, like there's a kind of development from the first repetition of habit. And what's repeated here, rather than the act itself being repeated, what's repeated is the ego as it's projected into the image of the act. We called this earlier in the series, way back at the beginning, we called this the doubling of the self. So that's the repetition here. The ego as it's projected into the image of the act as an I, or as an ego ideal, Deleuze calls it. And so whereas in the repetition of habit, the act was a reenactment of a prior original act, now the ego is being projected into the act, and the only way this can happen is if the act is identical in itself. The ego can only become equal to something, can only become capable of performing the action if that action is something identical with itself, something identical in itself. And this is all kind of represented by the names that Deleuze has chosen for these repetitions, right? The first is the repetition of habit, so an unconscious, something kind of controlled by the id, if you like, something which is completely outside of your control. It happens automatically, a behavior that you're not deliberately in control of. And then the second repetition is memory. So at this point, instead of pure habit, instead of being related to the id, now it's related to the ego. So there's a conscious element comes in here. Still unconscious, but it's the consciousness of the ego. And now there's just more control, more of an intentionality to the act, I think. Hence the move from habit to memory in those two repetitions. And so anyway, this intracyclic hypothesis, this is all representation, right? As made clear by the way that the first repetition is characterized by the negative, and the second repetition is characterized by the identical or the same. And this is, he calls this intracyclic, I think, because it's focused on specific acts within a single series, if you like. There's no getting outside of that. But on the second level, which Deleuze calls the extracyclic hypothesis, the before is repeated in a bare or mechanical fashion. So this is in the first repetition, the repetition of habit. The before is repeated in a bare mechanical fashion. Deleuze calls this the comic. And in the repetition of the during, so the second repetition, the individual again becomes capable of action, but this time by embracing disguise and displacement to repeat in line with difference. And Deleuze calls this tragic. And here the individual becomes equal not to the act, rather he purports to be equal to the whole of time. And presumably what Deleuze means here is this is because he's acting from out of the inner depths of his memory. And this is a reference back to Bergson's cone, if you can remember, which we talked about in connection with the second synthesis, the second synthesis or the second repetition. And this is clothed repetition. So here we have the bare and the clothed repetition, coming out in this extracyclic hypothesis. And this is extracyclic as opposed to intracyclic, I think, because it's now moving outside the specific acts themselves to explore memory as a whole. So getting outside specific series to within which an act can be placed to kind of the whole of one's memory, or the whole of one's life, actually, which is the same thing. The whole of one's existence, and incorporating different events from different series within that memory. So that's interesting because we didn't talk about intracyclic or extracyclic hypotheses when we looked at this in chapter 2, was it? Or at the very beginning when we talked about repetition. So there's some new stuff there. We did talk about the id and the ego and the superego, but not in the same way. So this is it's interesting that he put this in the conclusion, because I think this is not material that we've covered, and it adds more, I think, to what he's already talked about in that earlier chapter. But yeah, so interesting to know. Right, so if the third synthesis is enacted, if you like, can I use that word? If the third synthesis, the third repetition takes place, which it does in human beings, automatically, if you like, because it's not, remember, this is not a deliberate effort, it's not a deliberate act of will. These repetitions, they happen naturally, they happen, it's just what it is to be a human being, is to repeat in these in line with these three syntheses of Deleuze's. So once the third synthesis takes place, then it eliminates the two intracyclic and extracyclic hypotheses. It undoes them both and puts time into a straight line, straightening it out and extracting the pure form. So this is just that, a reference to the static, ordering, organizing nature of the third hypothesis, of the third synthesis. It undoes these two repetitions of habit and memory and binds them into this larger repetition, this repetition that imposes the structural character to human life. And this is where the eternal return enters the picture. The frontier is no longer between a first time and a repetition that it renders hypothetically possible, but between the conditional repetitions and the third repetition, or repetition within the eternal return, which renders impossible the return of the other two. The condition of the action by default does not return. The condition of the agent by metamorphosis does not return. All that returns, the eternal return, is the unconditioned in the product. So the before, which we referenced as the id, the comic, the bear, the past condition, and the during, which we talked about as the ego, tragic, clothed, and the present agent, don't return. They don't come back to be repeated in this third synthesis. Rather, what returns is the unconditioned in the product. So the groundlessness of this ordering process that is the pure form of time. And this third repetition then is the eternal return. So what repeats is repetition within the eternal return. The whole picture that Deleuze has been painting in the book, surrounding difference and repetition and the actualization of ideas into concrete realities. That's what returns once you get to this third synthesis, and that's what brings about the future and is the essence of the new, the novel, creativity, pure creativity. And he also talks a little bit here about simulacra, and what he has to say is that although the third synthesis is the empty form of time, it does have content in the sense that it structures or orders this content as a totality or a series. But its contents aren't empirical events, rather they are simulacra, which we defined as systems in which different relates to different by means of difference itself. So these events, the individual events, are not empirical in the sense that they are they can be modeled by representation. Each event is itself a repetition because we're referring it, but we're understanding it not through this model of representation, but through the model of difference that Deleuze has outlined. So each series then is explicated and unfolded only by implicating other series, repeating them and being repeated in them as they implicate it. I quite like that idea. It's not a direct quote, but it must be pretty close to a direct quote, I think. Each series is explicated and unfolded only by implicating the other series, repeating them and being repeated in them as they implicate it. So this is just like that disorder and chaos difference which dominates, which prevails within the idea, and out of which concrete realities are actualized. And I think that little sentence captures that process quite nicely, explicating and being explicated and implicated. There's a nice, those are just nice terms to capture, I think, the dynamism which is taking place, which characterizes ideas. And this brings us to the second part of the video today, the eternal return. So really the main idea here is the way that the same can be understood through the eternal return, or how the eternal return can be understood in terms of sameness and identity. And we talked about this earlier in the video, of course. Most of this we've talked about before. But he says that the eternal return can be thought of as the similar, the identical, the same, but only in the following sense. The same is the returning of that which returns. In other words, of the different. So the same is the returning of the different. The similar is the returning again of that which returns. In other words, of the dissimilar. So the only way we can talk about the similar, the identical, the same with regards to the eternal return is if we understand those words pretty much in the opposite way that the model of representation tries to understand them. If we understand the same as, it's kind of like form and content as well, not as the same thing returning, but the process which brings about that thing is what's returning. And that process is difference. The true distinction is not between the identical and the same, but between the identical, the same, or the similar, and the identical, the same, or the similar understood as secondary powers, but all the more powerful as such, turning around difference being said of difference itself. So there are basically two ways to think about the identical, the same, and the similar. Understood, Deleuze says, as secondary powers. So instead of treating them as original, as foundational, the way that representation does, we treat them as secondary, as derived from difference. And then he goes on to say that the eternal return produces the image of identity, resemblance, and the negative. And I've got a quote for this. However, the eternal return itself, in turning, gives rise to a certain illusion in which it delights and admires itself, and which it employs in order to double its affirmation of that which differs. It produces an image of identity as though this were the end of the different. It produces an image of resemblance as the external effect of the disparate. It produces an image of the negative as the consequence of what it affirms, the consequence of its own affirmation. It surrounds the simulacra and surrounds itself with this identity, this resemblance, and this negative. However, these are precisely a simulated identity, resemblance, and negative. So the eternal return, this process of difference playing itself out in ideas, the way that we've talked about before. It effaces itself. It covers itself over with identity, resemblance, and the negative. And that's just the way that the process must happen. It's the way that difference. It's the only way that concrete realities can be actualized through this process, if the difference that's at its core is hidden, is covered over, and is covered over by the same, the similar, identity, the negative. But the important thing is that if we forget this, we end up getting the whole thing backwards and believing that representation is the truth instead of difference. Instead of understanding bare repetition as the product of clothed repetition, and the latter as the power of difference, difference itself is made into a byproduct of the same in the concept, clothed repetition into a derivative of bare repetition, and bare repetition a byproduct of the identical outside the concept. So I think that's a really nice, clear quote to explain that idea. And the very last thing to talk about is being, just briefly. So Deleuze says that being has been understood as a univocity, or spoken of as one, as the same as identity. Those are the ways that being has been understood, or how the ways that being has been characterized or grasped. And the example that he gives is Spinoza here. Spinoza talked about attributes which aren't genera or categories, because while being formally distinct from each other, they're ontologically one in substance. And the same with modes. Modes aren't species because ontologically they belong to attributes, which relates them back to this univocal being substance. And Deleuze's solution to this error he sees is to reverse Spinoza. So Spinoza put substance first, when what he should have done is make substance turn around the modes. In other words, to realize univocity in the form of repetition in the eternal return. So again, coming back to that idea, the eternal return is the only same here. The only thing that's the same is difference. And I quite like that idea. If you're familiar with Spinoza and his ontology of substance, attribute, and modes, the truth as Spinoza sees it is in substance, is in one, that one universal absolute being. But Deleuze is saying the opposite. The truth is actually in the modes. That's where everything happens. And the substance, the one, the identity, the sameness, that is derivative of this. The modes is where everything's happening. But when we look at it, when we look at this process through the lens of the understanding of representation, it appears that the whole thing appears reversed. It appears as if that substance is the origin, but it's actually the other way around. Cool. Okay, so let's have a look at a summary. So first up, the pure form of time. There were two aspects to this, the time as totality and as series. And the totality was before, during, and after. This is time understood as a whole. And then time understood as a series was the first, the second, the third, and so on. And this was the content. So then we looked at the distribution of the first two repetitions within the third synthesis of time, the third repetition. And we broke this up into two levels, the intracyclic hypothesis. And in this, we talked about the first repetition of habit as before, with the id and the characterizing feature being the negative. And the second repetition as the during, in which was connected to the ego and characterized by identity. And what repeats in the first repetition, or repetition comes about in the first synthesis of habit, because one does not know or remember. That's why it was negative. And in the second repetition, what's repeated is the ego being projected into the I, which is taking over, which is capable of performing that act. And the second level, or the extracyclic hypothesis, again, the first repetition and the second repetition, the before we talked about as a bare repetition, and Deleuze called this the comic, and the second repetition with the during was clothed, and he described this as tragic. And then when the third repetition itself kicks in or is affected, it eliminates both intra and extracyclic hypotheses, and it eliminates them through this ordering, structural, or the imposing of this structure upon the whole series. And in this, content then appears as not as empirical events, but it appears as simulacra, embodied with or characterized fundamentally by difference. And then we looked at the eternal return. And basically the only way that we can talk about the same or the similar with regard to this is with the return of the different or the dissimilar. The only thing that is the same within the eternal return is the returning itself. And the returning itself is the process of difference, is difference playing out within the ideas. And the eternal return requires the overturning of the univocity of being, reversing Spinoza, so that we can't think of being as one, we can't think of it as identity or sameness. Being must be understood as difference or becoming. And we said that earlier in the video as well, earlier in the series. The true form of being is becoming. Or in Spinozan terms, substance must be made to turn around the modes. And that's us. That's difference and repetition. So I don't know what I'm going to do next. I've got a few things that I'm thinking of starting. But yeah, I haven't fully decided yet. I'll probably take a couple of weeks off because there are some other things I want to wrap up first. But we'll get started with another series later in Feb, I guess. But if you've stuck with me through this series anyway, from the beginning right to now, thanks for that. I hope that you've gotten something out of these videos. That it's always helpful for me to be able to explain stuff and to respond to comments and things. So that's awesome. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next series.